Since Destiny's release some 10 months ago, some longtime Bungie fans have been wondering about the game's story. Strong context surrounding the action is something we've become accustomed to getting from Bungie. Sure, fans have their favorites and not-so-favorites among the Halo games. Some claim Halo's story in general is shallow and overly derivative, and some critics came in at the end and didn't like or understand the story. Halo and Destiny both draw heavily from science fiction and fantasy cliches, and both drop a clunky line of dialogue here and there.
This cave is not a natural formation.
Not?
That wizard came from the moon.
But to many, something just felt off about the story in Destiny in a way that's not true of Bungie's earlier games. We're used to the story in Bungie games being there, and one of the most common claims about Destiny's story is that there isn't much there. And one of the most common defenses by fans against this criticism is that it doesn't need to have a story. While Bungie usually goes to some effort to contextualize the action in their games, they've also put an effort to ensure that paying attention to that context is purely optional. Is that all that's going on in Destiny? Is it as simple as Bungie no longer wanting or needing to tell a story with their games? Have they lost the ability to do so? Or is something else going on?
I could tell you of the great battle centuries ago.
To answer that, let's look back at previous Bungie franchises and how they've utilized gaming technology to tell stories, starting with the first Bungie linear campaign shooter, Marathon. I'm leaving out Pathways into Darkness. Bungie released Marathon in 1994 as a first-person shooter made on Macs. It brought technology on a par with the Doom engine to Mac OS and became a fairly popular engine for licensed games on that platform thereafter, but also brought to the table something Doom never even attempted: a cohesive fictional world with a consistent design philosophy, interesting characters, and a detailed plot. While Doom was a near-random mishmash of satanic imagery and beast sci-fi films, Marathon was visually a work of art, a fully realized science fiction universe with a deep backstory in which every pixel was placed for a reason. In comparison, Doom's scenario consists of a few inter-episode pages of text so poorly written a third grader would have been embarrassed to turn them in, providing a paper-thin excuse for putting monsters from hell onto Mars and telling the player to shoot them. Marathon, on the other hand, cribbed from sources like 2001 in that everything is set in motion by a computer that for various reasons goes a little crazy, and by humans coming into contact with aliens. Except that unlike in 2001, these aliens do not want to check you into a cool monochromatic hotel and turn you into a near-omnipotent star child. They want to enslave humanity, as they have already done with several other species, and you're all that's left to stop them. 90s technology being what it was, Marathon did not have any cutscenes, pre-rendered or in-engine. It had no voice acting. What it did have was text terminals. Lots of text terminals. While AAA games these days are basically trying to be movies, Marathon was trying to be a novel in game form, with its story spread out over hundreds of terminals, some of them essential, some of them optional, and quite a few of them hidden. While this choice was almost surely made because of technical and resource limitations, it also proved to be a remarkably flexible way to tell a story in a game. While using the terminals was almost always mandatory to complete levels and often gave important information on level objectives, including maps and instructions, players were largely free to engage with them, read them at their own pace, skim through them, or even skip them entirely if they wished. You can watch a cutscene or you can skip it. You can choose not to pay attention to it if you like, but most of the time it's an all or nothing thing. You can't just quickly scan it to get the general idea and come back to it later if it turns out you missed something. So Marathon was free to have an incredibly deep story with lots of background material in its universe, knowing that people could pore over it if they wished, and many did and choose to do so even now more than 20 years after its release, or just skip over it and get to the shooting. Plenty of fans of Bungie games credit Marathon with the company's deepest, most complex, and most interesting story, and it's probably fair to say that a big part of that is how that story is delivered and how the player can choose to experience it, through the text terminals. Then gaming technology improves and this starts to change. After 2 Marathon games, Bungie moves on to a new franchise. A small team breaks off to do a third Marathon scenario, which made that game's universe seem even more complicated, but Bungie switched gears and made the fantasy real-time tactics warfare game Myth. Myth featured a lot of the cinematic storytelling devices that were familiar in modern games. They were pre-rendered anime-style cutscenes and characters with voice acting. Every level now had an introductory sequence with a voiceover narration. The game engine was also used to stage little cutscenes to set up the story or advance it by temporarily wresting control away from the player. Many techniques we would continue to see used even today in Bungie games. The text wasn't removed, but it was reduced. No cutscene in the game is as long as any of the above-average length terminals in Marathon. The intro sequences feature voice narration over a text crawl, but unlike the terminals and more like a cutscene, you either have to play through it to the end or skip it entirely. There's no way to skim it. Even if you were to read faster than the narrator can, you can't get too far ahead, and there's no way to speed it up. Since you can and may skip it, it can't contain information necessary to complete the level, so that was moved into the shorter in-engine sequences as well as into hints that you could activate in the interface. Myth's story is also pretty darn interesting and engaging. It doesn't so much lack depth when compared to Marathon as it does weight, simply because it's delivered in fewer words. Then comes Halo. This series simultaneously marks a return to Bungie's roots insofar as it shares a lot of themes and elements with Marathon, as well as a big departure for Bungie, as it was originally announced as a Mac game in 1999, but was eventually released as an Xbox exclusive following the company's acquisition by Microsoft the following year. If Marathon was trying to be the computer game version of 2001 the novel, then Halo was trying to be the video game version of Aliens the movie. Fully voiced with in-engine cutscenes bookending each of its campaign levels, each Halo game was essentially a mini feature-length science fiction film with interactive action sequences. With the technological freedom to show high-resolution, fully realized and textured 3D environments and actors, and accompanied by an interactive film score that responded to the player's actions, there was no longer any need for text. The terminals and the text crawls went away, not to be seen again for many years. What Halo did share, though, with Marathon and Myth were traditional story structures. By and large, each game works as an isolated unit with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And before we bring up Halo 2, hold on, I'll get to that. Marathon introduced its world and gave the player an enemy, the Four, a race of alien slavers. Then it gave you some ambiguous allies and a way to defeat those enemies. An entire human colony is wiped out, but in the end you've avenged their deaths, led an alien revolution, and commandeered an alien ship. Marathon extends that scenario further as you expand the revolution against the slavers to the enslaved homeworld and discover secrets of a long-lost advanced alien race, the Yarrow. The slavers attempt to forestall their defeat with the use of a doomsday device, but you escape. Halo 1 introduces us to its background story, the desperate war between humanity and the alien coalition known as the Covenant, and then dives into its specifics, which is the encounter with the titular alien artifact, Halo. We find it, crash on it, discover 2 of its secrets, and then blow it the heck up. The entire series could have ended with that one game, and while one may have said it was a missed opportunity or untapped potential, you could not have called it incomplete. The same goes for all the other installations in the series. The one that brings the original trilogy to its conclusion, Halo 3, the side story, ODST, and the prequel, Reach. They introduce characters and conflicts and then bring them to resolution. There are always unanswered questions and unrevealed background material that don't make it into the games and thus turn into fodder for spin-off novels, forum speculation, and fan fiction, but by and large, these stories are complete. Except for Halo 2. Halo 2 ends just before what should have been its climax. Bungie wanted another year to finish the game, but Microsoft said no, and Bungie was forced to just end it, not even with a proper cliffhanger, but just as things were coming to a head, as if someone had been told to put the pencil down because time was up. Thus began Bungie's next major transition, back to being an independent company with control over its own intellectual property and its own release dates, as well as a shift to a gameplay model with a decidedly different relationship to story than the traditional single-player linear shooter. While Bungie had always been pushing multiplayer options in its games, starting with the multiplayer-only dungeon crawler Minotaur back on the Mac in 1992, Destiny is a departure from the usual separation of single-player and multiplayer. Sure, Marathon, Myth, and Halo all had extremely fun co-op modes, but Destiny isn't so much a light MMO as it is a shooter designed to be played first and foremost in cooperative mode, in shorter bursts, and more often. Even though it doesn't have a separate subscription fee, it seems to be part of the game's design to keep players engaged over a long period of time, rather than binging on 6 to 10 hours or so of campaign story once every 3 years, interspersed with a lot of contextless multiplayer carnage. You could still play Destiny that way, doing the story levels mostly by yourself and then spending the rest of your time in PvP like you would have done with Halo, but you'd probably be left feeling that something was missing. On the other hand, if you played Halo levels the way Bungie wants you to play Destiny levels, a different story level a day with changing modifiers, even the hardest core fan of Halo story would probably be skipping the cutscenes after a couple of weeks. Once cutscenes become something the players are going to be skipping far more often than they're going to be watching, you have to start wondering how much effort you should be putting into them. Destiny's cutscenes, and even including the 2 expansions released so far, clock in at a fraction of what Bungie delivered for all of the Halo games. Excluding difficulty variants and credit sequences, but including Easter eggs, Halo 1 delivers close to 40 minutes of in-engine cutscenes, mostly focusing on character development and plot advancement. Halo 2 included 48 minutes, Halo 3 46 minutes. ODST was originally supposed to be a sort of standalone expansion side story, and it ended up clocking in at almost 37 minutes of cutscene, a lot of it new characters and locations we hadn't ever seen in the series before. Fans balked at the title launching at full price because it had been marketed as an expansion, but there's no way around the fact that it was a full game in the Halo series. Sure, it didn't have separate multiplayer, but it did have firefight mode, and while it recycled the city streets geometry, it also did so no more aggressively than Destiny does, and possibly a great deal less so. Destiny, on the other hand, delivers only 32 minutes of cutscenes, even when you factor in the new scenes added by the last 2 expansions. And the bulk of those minutes are delivered at the beginning of the game, where it introduces the backstory, your Guardian and Ghost, the Tower and the Speakers, that's about 10 minutes, the Exo Stranger, the Queen of the Reef and her brother, that's about 11 minutes, and then the celebration of the Tower following the destruction of the Heart of the Black Garden, which is about 2 minutes. Those are the scenes that look like ones from Halo, the ones with relatable characters and custom animations. Of the remaining runtime, several of the scenes are just your ship flying into land, not exactly heavy lifting by the standards of Bungie cutscenes. While each expansion introduced new characters, Eris in the Dark Below, Varix and Petra Venge in the House of Wolves, although that's technically a return for Petra as we saw her way back at launch during the Queen's Wrath bounties, one major one has been noticeably missing. Ghost, as voiced by Peter Dinklage, who serves as a combination of Cortana and 343 Guilty Spark, along with the Covenant Prophets and UNSC military, Captain Keyes, Commander Commander Keyes, Lord Hood, and Sergeant Johnson, those two characters are the major sources of exposition and plot advancement in the Halo games. If Destiny were to depend on Ghost to the same degree, one would have to ask what the impact would be if that character suddenly went silent. Halo itself had problems with that, as voice actors for the Prophet of Truth and Commander Keyes were changed between Halo 2 and Halo 3. Thankfully, no changes were ever necessary for any of the other major characters, but what if there had been? What Destiny lacks so far, though, isn't necessarily depth, complexity, or even length, though it's arguably lacking all of those things when compared to Marathon, Halo, or even Myth, but completeness. Vanilla Destiny introduces us to the major enemy factions in the loose confederation referred to as the Forces of Darkness, the Fallen, Hive, Vex, and Cabal. As are most enemy factions in Bungie games, they are prone to fighting amongst themselves, and although this is usually a plot development, as it was in previous games, here it's just the state of play. In Marathon, we spearhead a revolt by the Spit against their enslavers, the Four. In Myth, we exploit ancient grudges between fallen lords to help defeat the Leveler, Balor, and his protege, Soulblighter. In Halo, the Master Chief is instrumental, sort of, in the schism in the Covenant that pits the first several of the Covenant races, and then only the elites, against the Prophets and Brutes. Alliances break apart and crumble, revolutions arise and throw down oppressors. So far, each of the four major enemy factions in Destiny are monolithic. They haven't broken down or fractured in any way. They fight against each other, but this isn't apparently a new development, it's just something that happens, presumably all the time. Each of Destiny's current 4 encounter areas feature a major and a minor faction, and each zone usually features at least one area where both factions are present and fight each other. We don't know why the forces that the speaker says are all forces of the darkness would want to fight each other, or why the darkness would want or allow it, and that is just another unanswered question to toss in the pile. As far as the player knows, these factions have always fought each other and always will. If humanity has barely survived the onslaught to date, think of what would have happened if our enemies had behaved in the collapse the way that they do when we play the game, stopping fighting each other to shoot at us. I can only assume there'd be nothing left. Adhering to traditional form would say that each game needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, even if it's intended to be part of a larger whole, even if it's a bunch of smaller pieces cut out of a larger whole. Destiny struggles with that. The only real plot arc we're given a complete picture of is the Exo Stranger Vex Heart of Darkness arc, where the Stranger, for some unknown reason, takes an interest in the player, even though there are lots of other Guardians running around, all being stalked by their own Exo Strangers, and who eventually sends us to Venus to tease us with some nonsense about the Vex, the Black Garden, and the Black Garden's heart.
Why have you been watching us?
I don't even have time to explain why I don't have time to explain. Have you heard of the Black Garden?
What is the Black Garden? We don't know. What is the heart? We don't know. What will destroying it do? No one can say. Perhaps like the Bungie and the speaker, the Exo Stranger could tell us a story, but is choosing not to. It might be great that the entire tower is celebrating our triumph over the Vex, which are given pride of place among the pantheon of Destiny's enemies for reasons that also aren't quite clear yet unless you've been reading a lot of the Grimoire and indulging in some rampant speculation. Everything else in the game is little more than introduction. The Fallen are machine-worshipping scavengers. The Hive are, well, monsters. The Cabal are soldiers. Who they are and what they fight for is unspoken. What the Traveler is and why they want to destroy it is as yet unknown. Why the Traveler came to Earth and gave humanity its golden age is still a mystery. The future of Destiny may hold the answer to these questions and more, or maybe these are just flimsy framing devices to keep us interested in the gun-leveling treadmill for another decade. I'd like to hope not, but that's where things come looping back to Halo 2. I think Halo 2 is where Bungie, or at least certain individuals at Bungie, either started to regret the decision to sell to Microsoft, or at the very least to begin to realize that the situation needed to be remedied if the studio didn't want to be locked into a new Halo title every 3 years, regardless of whether anyone actually wanted to tell new stories in that universe or not. Marathon, Myth, and Halo all originally envisioned as 2-part games, not trilogies, not quadrilogies, and not series that go on until one of its installments tanks so thoroughly that it either has to be rebooted or put out to pasture. Halo 2 is of interest firstly because of how it failed to end the series in the way I think Bungie intended, but also because it set up the need to make another whole game where Bungie actually didn't have another game's worth of story to tell. That's why the first part of Halo 3 mirrors Halo 2 so closely. Not that Bungie isn't already fond of reusing themes, locations, and missions, and why the next 2 Halo games were a side story and a prequel. I think more than anything else, Halo 2 taught Bungie that it makes a lot of economic sense to think long term, have control over your own IP, and make sure that you don't end up running out of material and having to come up with stuff on the fly just because you have to publish another game. Halo 1 could have stood on its own as a complete story, but Destiny could not, because it's not designed to. It's an introductory chapter where a lot of things get started and very few get finished. Bungie's contract with Activision specifies multiple games in the Destiny franchise, with multiple expansions each year for each of those titles over the span of a decade, and if the franchise is continuing to succeed financially as that period comes to a close, Activision will almost certainly want more. What I think Bungie wants is the freedom to decide for itself whether it will continue at that point or not, as well as the ability to conserve the material they have and dole it out across that decade without running dry. Is this actually what Bungie has planned? Do they have answers to the unanswered questions? Are they deliberately holding on to details that will make sense of Destiny's story, such as it is, in order not so much to hold us in suspense, but at least to hold our attention until the release schedule is complete? Whereas Destiny's designed so close to that of an MMO that story is no longer a concern, that only the bare minimum amount of context is necessary to keep people playing. I think the care and detail paid to the Grimoire indicates the former rather than the latter, but there's the problem, and a lot of people have already pointed it out. While Marathon's terminals were the perfect vehicle for delivering story at the volume and pace determined by the player, the Grimoire is a poor compromise. It sits completely outside and separate from the game, relegated to the web interface, the companion app, and community efforts. You can read it thoroughly, skim it quickly, or ignore it almost entirely, just like the Marathon terminals, but all of those activities are completely divorced from playing the game, completely unlike the Marathon terminals. Halo's cutscenes demanded your attention, and you could only watch them as presented or skip them entirely. Bungie seems afraid of this, delivering cutscenes that usually can't be skipped once they've been started, but delivering fewer of them less often, perhaps out of fear that players will tire of them after playing for years at a rate of 2 strikes and 7 heroic stories per week per character, plus raids. Bungie has mentioned that the Taken King expansion will address concerns of players who are dissatisfied with Destiny's story, but it's hard not to take a wait-and-see attitude towards it. After one expansion devoted to the Hive, and then a second devoted to the Fallen, the Taken King goes back to the Hive again, giving us Oryx to fight in the place of his fallen son Crota. His gimmick is that he is king of the Taken, enemies we already know and hate who've been modified in terms of appearance, behavior, and abilities. I'm optimistic about the expansion, but it's also hard not to see a little bit of Diablo 2 palette switching in that approach, and it wouldn't be the first thing that Destiny had borrowed from that game. When all is said and done, Bungie may be able to tell us a story to frighten us, a story of the war between humanity and the darkness. These days, however, the players are frightened anyway.